Dig your hand in the land. We're gonna have a meeting, everybody.
Hi, I'm Janet Cubitt, bringing you this week's edition of In the Tractor Seat, brought to you by Minnesota Farmers Union. Former Extension climatologist Mark Seeley is in the tractor seat this week to talk about the weather. Thank you to the audience for joining us today, and be sure to submit your questions via the chat feature. We'll get to them later in the program. First, a little more about Mark. Many of you have heard Mark speak across the state as the Extension climatologist. He also managed the Weather and Climate Education program, as well as doing research and teaching. He has served as a weekly commentator on Minnesota Public Radio's Morning Edition news program and written the weekly newsletter Minnesota Weather Talk since 1992. Mark has worked with the Twin Cities Public Television to produce award-winning documentaries on Minnesota's memorable historical weather events and on how climate change is affecting the state's infrastructure and natural resources. He is author of the Minnesota Weather Almanac and co-author of Voyager Skies, Weather in the Wilderness in Minnesota's National Park. Mark worked at the University of Minnesota from 1978 to 2018. And thank you, Mark, for joining us this week.
Oh, you're welcome. It's a pleasure to be with you, Janet. And I would like to highlight for our audience briefly, I'm going to share the screen here, a few comments and visuals related to the 2021 growing season, if you don't mind. So I'll do that.
Take it away.
The 2021 growing season was not forecasted for what it turned out to be. Certainly in terms of temperature and growing degree days, it ranks among the top 3 in all of the brownish tinted states on this slide, including Minnesota. So a very, very warm growing season indeed. And the western states even higher, all-time records set in many of the western states. No one would have forecasted this back at spring planting time. We were expecting a warmer than normal growing season, but not one that would be so close to record setting in so many places. In terms of the drought that materialized, it reached its peak in early August, but it really began to grow and intensify during the months of May, June, and July. And it was compounded by one of the earliest and strongest June heat waves that the state of Minnesota has ever seen. And many, many temperatures, hundreds of warm temperature records, both warm maximum daily temperatures and warm nightly minimum temperatures were set during the month of June, early on in the growing season. And so this is where Minnesota was not alone in this. Again, all the light tan colored states on this map show the areas that were more or less under that same spell of dryness that persisted from May through July. I might add, there were a few points in Minnesota where in the Red River Valley where it was near record setting. And then the peak of the drought occurred in early to mid-August. This is a map from the U.S. Drought Monitor that shows the areas. The severe to extreme to exceptional drought accurately occupied 88% of the state landscape at that time. The red areas of the state show the counties or the landscape that was near 50% of the land area of the state that was in extreme to exceptional drought at that time. Much of the north, as we speak today, much of northern Minnesota is still in the grip of this drought. And that is in evidence by the extreme low flows in many of the watersheds that are being measured in northern rivers and streams. Lastly, I just want to make a couple of comments, Janet, if I might, before we transition. Much has been in the paper recently, or in the news media recently, that the National Oceanic and Atmospheric Administration has declared that a La Nina episode is in play in the equatorial Pacific. For the audience, I would add that historically for Minnesota, having a La Nina episode in place during the winter season has correlated with a colder than average winter season. However, this expectation should be tempered greatly by the recent trend of very warm winter seasons in Minnesota. And so a lot of the models used by the National Oceanic and Atmospheric Administration are continuing to favor the trend for this winter over what the historical La Nina correlation is. So on this map, you'll see that the light yellow and the orange coloration on this map shows an expectation for November, December, and January to bring above normal temperatures to those areas of the country. In terms of precipitation, most of the models for the winter season are leaning towards a bit wetter than normal. I want to caution, not record setting by any means, but a bit wetter than normal for the winter season is the current outlook. So those are some of the comments I wanted to lead off with. I'll break out of this and get back to our conversation, Janet, if you don't mind. And then
Well, I'm so glad you brought up La Nina, because I was going to ask you about that.
Oh, okay, sure.
And you say wetter than normal, or that's also good news for much of Minnesota.
Yes, there are areas that are still, as we wrap up the year, we do have areas in western Minnesota that have had one of their driest years as a whole. We have many parts of the state that have received less than 15 inches of precipitation for the entire year, Janet. So that is extraordinarily low. And even in traditional wetter locations, southern Minnesota counties or southeastern Minnesota counties, traditionally wetter than most other areas of the state, they too could use a surplus of precipitation as we end the year and go into the winter season.
Yeah, I've noticed around here in southeastern Minnesota that the gravel pits, they're way down from the historical level.
Right.
And looking at the drought monitor, we're getting drier. We're still abnormally dry. Where we've spent most of the year, we're still there. Is there any?
Right. Yeah.
Is there relief? Do you think?
Yeah. I think we might be. I think it's more realistic, or should I say, more probable, to have an expectation that as we move into next spring, and by that I mean the March-April period ahead of the planting season, that we might still need some more precipitation to replenish the full soil profile. You know, the rains we get in early spring as we lose the soil frost, they're pretty good at replenishing the shallow layers of the soil, but we'll need more than that to get the whole root zone of the soil replenished, if you know what I mean.
Yeah, and we talked about that. Our yields were so good, way better than anybody expected in southeastern Minnesota. Well, in this part, further south, they had more rain.
Right.
Further southeast, but our crops were still good. Is that because we had a good chunk of soil moisture going into the growing season?
Yes, I think that's a definite sign of that. And our measurements in the past, when I worked with all of the agricultural experiment stations in the state, they would suggest that the reason those crops came in better than expected this year is because they were very successful at mining the deeper moisture in the root zone. So that as we do go into winter, we would expect that the measurements of soil moisture deeper into the root zone are probably very much in deficit, and they very much need more replenishing.
Well, and I remind the audience that they can submit their questions at any time too. Let's talk, Mark, about Southern Research and Outreach Center. They've measured back 100 years of moisture, and they were getting wetter. Do you think that this is a trend where we're going to start getting drier years, or is this abnormally, or is there no normal anymore?
Right. It's a good point. Let me answer that in two parts, Janet. If we think about trends, the trends as we step through time are upward in precipitation. So most places in southeastern, south central, southwestern Minnesota, as we calculate sort of a running average of their precipitation, the number keeps getting larger. That's a given, that's a definite. All the research has shown that that is the direction of the long-term trend. But to answer your question specifically, what we need to pay attention to is the variation, the ups and downs, the excessive wetness as well as the excessive dryness seems to be amplifying in our lifetime, so that when we do have variation, it's more extreme. When we have variation and it's wetter than normal, it's way wetter than normal. When we have variation and it's drier than normal, it's way drier than normal. So we've lost that historical picture, which used to show more moderation in the variation, is now very much more amplified. So that's kind of what's going on with those parts of the state.
Well, and that's also lends itself to the fact that we don't get all day nice soaking rains. We get a heavy thunderstorm or a heavy rain, and then it's done.
You're absolutely right. The fraction, in fact, if we calculate like say we take the total annual precipitation at Waseca, let's take a number like 35 inches a year, okay? What we're finding in our lifetime is a larger and larger fraction of that 35 inches a year is coming in big dose events where we get the 2-inch rain or the 3-inch rain that occurs over only 3 or 4 hours, just exactly as you were describing, Janet. And so instead of a nice all-day soaker rain, we get the big dose events, and those are occupying the lion's share of that annual precipitation of 35 inches.
And that has implications for how we farm going forward and how we design our drainage systems.
Absolutely. There's been a widespread response to that in terms of tile drainage, a lot more attention paid to tile drainage than ever before in history, in terms of buffer strips, in terms of protection from, grass strip protection or some kind of strip protection from erosion. We're trying to protect the soil on the slope areas from running off. And then the other critical thing is timing of the application of fertilizer and pesticide. Because if they're mistimed and they get clobbered by one of these 4-inch rains, it can turn into a disaster, and not just a disaster on the farm, Janet, but a disaster for those downstream from the runoff, if you know what I mean. So
yeah,
we're having to be a lot more careful with those kinds of decisions.
yeah. We have a question from Linda Larson, and she wants to know if you think that we in Minnesota are headed into many more extreme weather events like we see in other parts of the world and the nation.
Yes, we have all kinds of evidence to support that. The number of records we're setting each year in both precipitation and temperature is magnified. They're larger than we would normally expect from our history of measurement, which we're blessed in this state. We have a history of measurement that goes back deep into the 19th century. And those extreme rainfall events in particular, the ones where we get 6 inches or 8 inches or 10 inches or even 17 inches, like we got down in Houston County back in August of 2007. So those are shall we say, increasing in frequency. And so I expect that that will go on throughout our lifetime. The scary thing for me is, as one who's been a professional atmospheric and climate scientist for nearly 50 years, is here I am still getting surprised. I'm still getting surprised by some of these numbers. And I go, I'm going, I never would have expected that to be measured in that spot. But by golly, you know, that's what's happening. And it's funny, I've heard this more this summer from my colleagues further north up in Canada, you know, because Canada also, their frequency of extremes has increased. And so no meteorologist in Canada would have ever estimated that Lytton, British Columbia, the little town in British Columbia called Lytton, would have recorded a 121-degree air temperature this summer. Nobody that I know would have ever estimated that that could occur.
Wow. And we have a question from Kathy Seaman. Is there any data showing when the big dumps of rain come? Do they come in the spring or when the bare soil, that's a huge soil loss? Or do they come when we've got more green cover on our soils?
There's no definitive, well, yeah, to describe that in general terms is very difficult because you have to be conscientious about the geography. In parts of Minnesota, this has started to happen later in the year rather than earlier in the year. So the big 8, 10, 12-inch rains are July, August, and September rather than May and June. That's not to say they can't occur in May or June. I'm just saying that the frequency of those great big events has migrated later on the calendar to July, August, and September. We can still get those heavy dose events in May and June. They just don't come as frequently as we see later in the year. But we all know, we've seen, for example, one scary thing is back in 2005 in October, which would be, shall we say, the prime window for harvesting and doing fall field work. We had 5 to 7 inch rains in October. Now that's almost unprecedented for October to deliver that amount of moisture. So that's a bit scary that as we migrate into the future, we might be facing some rather extreme precipitation events like that right during our critical, harvesting season.
I know my farmer husband, he's like, oh no, it's gonna rain. I'm like, well, we need rain. But he was totally in harvest mode, so he didn't want any rain.
Yeah, right, yeah.
We have another question. We are seeing faster spring warm-ups and longer summer month temperatures here in Lutsen, 3 miles from Lake Superior. Can we expect this trend to continue?
Absolutely, no doubts about that. The onset of spring is coming earlier on the calendar. The season that we call winter is shrinking in duration. Now, not to say that we can't have some deviations from that and still get snow and cold in April, but if we look at this in, let's say, decadal segments, 10-year segments instead of year by year, we see that the onset of spring is coming much earlier. So soils are thawing out and soil temperature is rising a bit earlier on the calendar than it used to. Rainfall, instead of getting the nice low cloud frontal system, gradual rainfall, sprinkles, maybe even a few flurries and things like that in the spring, we're more commonly getting rains early in the spring, and in some cases, pretty heavy rains earlier in the spring. And so that's another sign that springs are coming earlier, and especially up around the Lake Superior where that question was from, Lutsen. Mm-hmm. Lake Superior, the temperature habit of Lake Superior is changing, where ice cover is rarely as extensive as it once was, and the lake surface water temperatures are warming up earlier in the spring. So we're seeing all kinds of changes like that go on.
Yeah, I know if you enjoy winter sports, it's really hard to find a place where there's consistent snow anymore.
You're absolutely right. I've heard from the tourism industry and a lot of resort owners, Janet, that it's kind of the northern half. If you're an outdoor recreational fan in winter, you know, snowshoeing, skiing, snowmobiling, whatever it is you're doing, that to have consistent snow cover now, or rely on consistent snow cover when you schedule these things weeks and months ahead of time, you need to think about northern Minnesota, because the snow cover in the southern half of Minnesota has become too intermittent. You can't
Mhm.
really count on it being there.
Yeah, I know the snow belt doesn't get used as much as it used to.
Yeah.
We had a comment about early spring is certainly coming, because this panelist or this viewer had 90 degrees and hail in March.
Oh yeah. Yeah, unbelievable. That's not surprising. And we've had 100 degrees in April. I mean, how many associate 100-degree air temperatures with April? I don't think we normally think about that. But so yeah, that kind of thing. The surprises, to answer the earlier question a little bit more succinctly, that was about extremes and should we expect more extremes? I actually expect more extremes to surface as we go into the future in the shoulder seasons of spring and autumn, you know, when we're transitioning, because the seasonality character of Minnesota historically has been very distinct, but now it's changing dramatically. And we're actually measuring more extremes in the shoulder seasons than we are in the heart of winter or the heart of summer.
We've got a question about the trend on the date of the first killing frost. I mean, this year was really late. Is that moving later statewide?
Yes, this year statewide, it was remarkably late. It was, in relative terms, it was more of a surprise how late it was in northern Minnesota than in southern Minnesota. In northern Minnesota, this was a remarkable year for frost coming late. And that is a trend. That is a
Okay.
definite trend, that it's a decade by decade as we step through time. The frost dates are getting, the killing frost dates are getting later and later on the autumn calendar.
I'm still covering some plants. I'm hoping that to make them go a little longer. We had talked before about how the nights are getting warmer, not
Yes,
only the days, but also the nights, and how that's contributing to more growth in our crops.
yes,
Could you speak a little bit about how the nighttime temperatures are expecting that or
yes.
impacting growth?
I've talked, or probably the last 10 years I was at the university full time, I talked about this topic about as much as any. The evidence for this is emphatic. This is like a slap in your face evidence, Janet. This is evidence you can't ignore. As we look at the recent measurements in our lifetime, the record-setting values of warm nights are double. They're twice the number of the record-setting daytime temperatures. So, and the mean values, even the average values of nighttime temperature, are warming at twice the pace of the daytime values of maximum temperature. Now this is not universally true. I mean, if we talk to growers in Kansas or Missouri or Indiana, we wouldn't be saying this. But the higher latitude you are, the more northern your location in the Midwest, the more this is happening. And it's even more emphatic up in the provinces of Canada, Ontario and Manitoba and Saskatchewan. The nighttime warming is roughly twice the pace of the daytime warming. And of course, you get more respiration from growing plants. Therefore, you get, as you alluded to, you get more rapid growth. You get more rapid growth. It's also a factor with some pests, with some insects and weed. I mean, weed growth is just, I can't tell you how many times I've heard farmers say that some weed they observed in the row spacing in their field grew twice its height in one night, or something like that. Or it's going to be the nighttime temperatures are going to have some weight with respect to the effectiveness of weed control, with the respect to the effectiveness of a insecticide or pesticide. So we should be cognizant that that trend is very much magnified and probably going to have effects that we might not even anticipate yet.
We've got a question regarding nighttime temperatures during the winter months. Are they also warmer in the winter?
Yes, they are. And that's why whenever we go to sub-zero now, it seems like a shock to us. We used to have a lot more sub-zero nights once upon a time than we do now. For example, just last February, when we had those 2 weeks of sub-zero nights, everybody thought the ice age was coming because that was very common. That was quite common back in the 30s, 40s, 50s, and 60s, and even 70s, those decades. But it's become so uncommon now that we've gotten used to it. And so when we do have a variation that takes us down that path, and all of a sudden we have 2 weeks of cold, we go, oh my God, this must be record setting. Well, it's not. It's just a return to a pattern that once existed. So,
well, and and the question further asks, are we thawing faster? And I don't. Do we ever really get a good freeze? We go back and forth. I know we're getting a lot more ice here in southern Minnesota, southeastern Minnesota.
Right. Well, people all over the state should pay attention to this trend because a lot of the counties and the Minnesota Department of Transportation has load limit restrictions that go in on some roads and highways at certain times of the year. And a lot of this is based on the freeze thaw that goes on in the soil. Okay. Now, what's happened now with the pace of change in our climate is during the winter season when we were used to go below freezing and stay below freezing week after week after week after week. You could count on the ground being frozen and remaining frozen for long periods of time. But now we're having freeze thaw cycles in the shallow layers of the soil. We're having freeze thaw cycles that are 5 times as frequent as what they used to be in the past. So this changes everything. You have to be real careful because moving heavy loads across landscapes, as we all know, can cause serious damage with compaction and things like that. Yeah.
Well, thank you, Mark. It's time to wrap up. We got a really good discussion today. Thank you for joining us.
Oh, you're welcome, Janet. Thank you. And I wish everyone well. And as they say in Minnesota, have the wardrobe ready for anything this winter.
No, Mark is a professor emeritus and former extension climatologist with the University of Minnesota. Join us next week when we're talking about corn and soybeans with Seth Nave and Jeff Coulter from the University of Minnesota. And check out past episodes on our YouTube channel and learn more about Farmers Union at mfu.org. Thank you.
Dig your hand in the land.